Similar to cognac, the art of the Canadian whiskey maker is all about blending these base and flavoring whiskeys to produce the finished product they're going for. Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. Bottle number 83 is Lot 40 Canadian whiskey. When I found this bottle in Reveal 16, I noted that while in Canada we call all Canadian whiskey rye, this one was a real rye whiskey. But I have to apologize to my birthplace of Canada for importing that little bit of American imperialism. I blame the fact that I didn't start drinking whiskey until I was well into my 30s, after I've already lived in the US for years. So that's where I learned what it meant to be a rye whiskey, and under US law, that requires that at least 51% of the grain used to make the whiskey needs to be rye. But that's not what it means to be a rye in Canada. Neither definition is more right or wrong. Sorry, eh? To understand how the word rye in Canada came to be a synonym for whiskey in general, we have to go back to the beginning of distillation in Canada. Teaching cocktail classes in the US, I hadn't really needed to know all that much about Canadian booze history. But now that I'm starting to turn up more Canadian whiskey bottles in Grandma's collection, it was time to dive in, which I did thanks to Davin de Kergamo's excellent book, Canadian Whiskey, the Essential Portable Expert. We most often associate whiskey distilling with Scottish and Irish immigrants because they were so good at it back home. But in Canada, it was mostly English settlers who established the first commercial distilleries. In particular, they were often grain merchants who'd attach a distillery to their wheat grist mill and turn the leftovers, called middlings, into whiskey. The trouble with whiskey made from wheat middlings, though, is that most of the flavor already went into the flour. Especially before barrel aging was commonplace, that made for not particularly good tasting whiskey. It was most likely Dutch and German settlers who inspired the change that would define the flavor of Canadian whiskey and is the reason Canadians call it all rye. They had tons of experience distilling rye in their homelands and had played a major role in developing the rye-focused style of whiskey that was dominant in the American colonies at the time. So they were probably the ones who suggested that adding even a small amount of rye to the middlings would create a much tastier whiskey. And they were right. Thus, a savvy whiskey salesman would need to differentiate this new, tastier whiskey from his regular all-wheat whiskey. That was just called whiskey. The premium product, though, was called rye whiskey. This was true even when only 1 to 10% of the grain used was rye. And even though it cost more, rye whiskey was so preferred that plain old whiskey pretty much disappeared, and only rye remained. Today, this plays out in a uniquely Canadian way of making whiskey. The traditional bulk of a Canadian whiskey is base whiskey, usually made from corn, distilled to a high proof, and then aged in used barrels. To that are added one or more flavoring whiskeys. These are made from rye, corn, barley, and other grains, which are usually fermented and distilled on their own, then aged. Similar to cognac, the art of the Canadian whiskey maker is all about blending these base and flavoring whiskeys to produce the finished product they're going for. Which brings us back to my tiny bottle of Lot 40. While the brand is on the market today, the tiny bottle in Grandma's collection is from its first release in 1998. Lot 40 was created by distiller Mike Booth at Hiram Walker, who named it after a plot of land owned by his distiller ancestor, Joshua Booth. It was pretty revolutionary at the time because it was bottling the kind of 100% rye whiskey that would normally be used as a flavoring whiskey. It was made from 90% rye and 10% malted rye, aged in used barrels. Unfortunately, it came a little too early. The craft cocktail renaissance wouldn't really get going until the early 2000s, bringing with it a renewed appreciation for American-style rye-heavy whiskey. So while it was beloved by some connoisseurs, this expensive and weird whiskey struggled to find a market and disappeared within a few years. I first became aware of Lot 40 during its second life. In 2012, the brand was relaunched, and this time it found a ready market excited about rye whiskey. The 2012 release made a key change from the 1998 iteration, aging the whiskey in new barrels, like American bourbon and rye makers use. A further change in 2013 removed the malted rye from the recipe. That's the version that would be my introduction to Lot 40 in 2017, when I invited their Detroit area brand ambassador to be a special guest at one of my cocktail classes. It shouldn't be at all surprising that I am pretty darn excited to taste this little piece of history. Rye is my favorite whiskey, and I've liked all the bottles of Lot 40 I've tried so far, so it will be interesting to see how it started, and I'm hoping to find someone fun to taste it with. Be sure to subscribe so you won't miss that episode when it happens. Drop a comment or a like while you're down there, and please share your favorite My Tiny Bottles episodes with a friend. Hit up Patreon to support the project and access bonus content. You can also find me at My Tiny Bottles on Facebook and Instagram, as Tammy LC on Blue Sky, and at my website, mytinybottles.com. Cheers!